Every season, tens of thousands of WoW players consume tier lists and meta rankings, and many of them come away with the exact same conclusion. If I'm not playing an S tier class, I'm trolling and I'm never going to get anywhere in the game. And for the vast majority of players, that conclusion is completely wrong. Now, to be clear, I am not saying that class balance doesn't matter or that the meta somehow isn't real. It clearly is. What I am saying though is that most players apply tier list logic at a level of gameplay where it barely affects their success or failure at all. So today I want to break down where the meta actually starts to matter, why tier lists are functionally useless to the vast majority of the player base, and how they typically damage player behavior and community cohesion overall. If you stick around until the end, I'll also show a simple web tool that you can use to judge whether meta tier lists are actually relevant to you personally. The issue isn't that tier lists or meta comps exist, it's when the information built for the top end gets treated like gospel by everybody else in the player base. At their core, tier lists are trying to communicate one thing: the relative strength of one spec compared to another. That usually comes down to a combination of things like damage output, damage profile, survivability, and group utility. From there, those rankings then start to shape comp building. In Mythic Plus, that doesn't always just mean the 5 individually strongest specs on paper. More often, it means the 5 specs that work best together that are also tuned fairly well. At the absolute highest level of play, relative spec strength and group composition absolutely do matter. When players are pushing right up against the limit of what is even possible, every single optimization counts, no matter how small it might be. This is exactly where tier lists are at their most useful. But how big of a difference is it really? And at what point does it actually start to matter to you as a player? That's what I want to explore here. I'm not out on some kind of witch hunt against tier lists or the meta or anything like that. What I want to do is take a more objective look at how much of an impact all of it really has at the different levels of gameplay. To show this properly, we're going to have a look at keystone scaling. In Mythic Plus, enemy health and damage increases as a function of the key level. On screen, you can see a table with some of the numbers. The first thing to note is that the scaling is exponential. The jump from a +2 to a +3 is only 14%, but the jump from a +14 to a +15 is 27%. So, if we take that scaling and graph it out against key level, you can see how sharply the dungeon difficulty starts to ramp up. I'm also going to add a line on the graph that represents the rough upper limit of what is currently possible to complete. That number will change from season to season, but for this example, we're going to be basing it off the highest key level completed in the previous season, which was around a +22. Now, let's build 2 hypothetical comps. The first is a full meta comp, the strongest 5-player roster that you can possibly get in the current season's tuning. The second is an off-meta comp, not a troll comp, not like 5 monks or something, just a reasonably constructed group that doesn't happen to include the 5 top-tier specs. We are going to add these to our graph to indicate the rough performance ceilings of each of these teams. You can see on this that the meta does sit above the off-meta comp, and that separation isn't just arbitrary as well. I've spaced these 2 groups out by roughly 10% of the effective difficulty. That's intentionally fairly wide. If you look at the current DPS tuning, 10% is roughly the sort of gap that you would expect to see between a very bottom-end spec and a very top-end spec. So if we loosely account for things like utility and survivability that is typically better with your higher-end specs, then we fall on a number around 10%. However, in reality, the gap between the 2 comps is likely even smaller than this. If we zoom in to the absolute top end of the graph, it becomes pretty obvious why the meta comp gets picked. At that level, the margins are so thin that the comp can genuinely affect whether a key level is even possible or not. But if we zoom back out to a normal key level, let's say a +14, look at the sheer gap between the ceiling and the point that the key is actually at. That gap there dwarfs the difference between the 2 comps. And that gap there is what I would call the skill gap. It represents everything that sits outside of comp choice: routing, mechanics execution, cooldown usage, utility, decision making, deaths, overall throughput, group coordination, yada yada yada. All of those things that the player can directly control have a much bigger impact on their success than simply picking the stronger comp. This is where I think tier lists and spec rankings fundamentally mislead the player base. Yes, some specs are always going to be tuned a little bit stronger than others. That's unavoidable. But when people look at the relative rankings in a vacuum, they ignore all the other factors that have a much bigger impact on success or failure than class tuning ever will. If we go back to our graph, imagine you fail your plus 14 by 10 seconds. It's very easy to look at that and think, well, if I had a meta comp, maybe we time that key. And maybe you do, but that line of thinking completely ignores this enormous gap between where your group performed and where it could potentially perform. Everything else in that gap encompasses all of the things that are irrelevant to your comp. Maybe your route was inefficient. Maybe your cooldowns were used poorly. Maybe you missed a lot of kicks. Maybe your defensives weren't used. People died. Damage was placed into the wrong target. All of those things sit inside the skill gap, and all of them matter far more than whether you brought the third best spec versus the ninth best spec. I joked earlier about a 5 monk comp because yes, it's objectively terrible, but I would bet everything that I own that a 5 monk comp, despite how flawed it is, could comfortably time a plus 14 in the hands of genuinely competent players. And we will see versions of this every single season. Up near the top end of the graph, around roughly where the 0.1% title sits, you will see players on every single spec crossing that line every season, despite the fact that their spec is undertuned compared to the top classes. But if we look only at relative rankings, if we look only at the tier list, we flatten all of that into just a binary comparison. We stop seeing what actually contributes to success or failure and instead fixate on one variable that, for most players, is tiny compared to everything else that's actually going to determine the outcome. You might be wondering why I'm sitting here putting so much effort into making this point. Surely it's not that big of a deal, right? But I genuinely think it is. I think it's a massive deal. Because the misapplication of tier lists promotes some incredibly antisocial behavior in the community. How many times have you experienced personally or heard from someone else experiencing that they struggled to get into groups purely because they weren't playing a specific spec? It's one of the most common complaints in the entire Mythic Plus community. That is exactly why I wanted to make this video. If I can get even a handful of players to properly understand how small relative spec strength usually is compared to the other factors that determine success or failure in Mythic Plus or in any other facet of competitive WoW, then I'll consider that a success. But it goes beyond group behavior as well. Tier lists also encourage some really bad personal habits when people don't understand them in relative terms. A player who takes these rankings as gospel is much more likely to blame tuning for their lack of progress. A tank might say, man, I can't push on this spec. VDH is only B tier. I'd be way higher up if I was on Brewmaster. And yes, while in a relative sense, Brewmaster, or whatever happens to be the S tier tank at the time, may very well be stronger, that is only one variable, and for most players, it is absolutely dwarfed by everything else affecting their performance. In other words, if these tier lists get consumed without proper knowledge of when to apply them, it actually blocks improvement. The player will start externalizing their problems onto class tuning, and in doing so, ignore the far bigger factors that are actually dictating whether they're going to succeed or fail in something like a Mythic Plus run. So what do I actually recommend to players? Well, based on everything I've shown above, my advice is actually pretty simple. If you're playing a key level which is nowhere near the top end of the ladder, like say below the top 1%, then tier lists are completely useless to you. On top of this, if you're not pushing into the top 1% of keys, I really don't think that you should be rerolling based purely off of meta and tier list rankings. And even if you are pushing into that range, off-meta picks are still completely playable, You're just taking on a little bit more difficulty. And if you're forming a group for anything that is outside of that top end gameplay, especially if it's below like the top 10%, if it's like a weekly vault key or just like a casual push key, you should be willing to invite basically any spec. If the run fails, the comp was really not the main reason why. To go along with this, I've also made a funny little web tool as well. It's partly a joke, but it's also giving pretty accurate advice. You just put in your Mythic Plus score or your key level, and it will compare that score to the wider player base at the time, and then tell you whether you should care about tier lists or not. So if you've got a meta slave friend who needs to see this, send it their way. If you take anything away from this video, let it be this. For most players, success or failure in Mythic Plus is dictated far more by things like mechanical execution or group coordination than it is by what spec you happen to be playing or what spec your party members happen to be playing. I also want to quickly give a huge thank you to my YouTube members and Buy Me a Coffee supporters, Ghost Splinter, The Joy of Checks, and Tobias at the Keystone Legend tier, as well as KSL and everybody else supporting the channel. Much love to you all. If you enjoyed the video, do all the YouTube things, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thank you very much for watching, gamers. Until next time, take care.